Hi everyone, welcome to this lecture on Tragedy of the Commons for AP Environmental Science. So we're going to look at two topics today. That's topic 5.1, which is Tragedy of the Commons. The enduring understanding for that is when humans use natural resources, they alter natural systems. And then the learning objective is explain the concept of the Tragedy of the Commons. And then we're skipping all the way ahead to topic 5.12, which is Introduction to Sustainability. And the enduring understanding for that is humans can mitigate their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use, and then explain the concept of sustainability. We're just going to introduce sustainability today, and then we're going to connect sustainability to all of the land and water uses that we're going to discuss throughout the rest of this unit. The vocab is here, so you can pause this now and jot it down if you want to. And I'm going to start this off with a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. The world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. All right, so Tragedy of the Commons, a little bit of background. This was first described by William Forster Lloyd, who was an economist in the 1800s. However, he did not use the term tragedy of the commons. Okay, the first example of tragedy of the commons, though, and it was a hypothetical example. What we have is an English commons. So in an English commons, say that we have a town. So we have our little British English town. Okay, streets, roads, and let's just say that everybody there is a shepherd. And then all of them will take their sheep out to these shared pastures that are outside of the village, surrounding this village. And they would rotate from one pasture to the next. But let's say that all of these shepherds take their sheep over to this pasture. They all graze on it. Okay? Um, it's a shared common area, which is why it's called a common. Okay, so it's a common pasture for everybody to graze their sheep on. And then they would obviously rotate between these different pastures as the year goes by or the season goes by. If one of those shepherds puts one more sheep on the pasture, then it really is a detriment to everybody else. That person gets a little bit more profit. So my example here is cows, but I keep saying sheep. But for each additional sheep that it gets put onto that pasture, you get more profit for the individual herder. So the guy that adds that extra sheep gets a little bit more money, but it starts to lead to overgrazing of that pasture to the detriment of everybody. Okay, so if everybody made that same logical decision in self-interest, everybody wants a little bit more money so they can buy a little bit more stuff and food and everything. Those common pastures will eventually be depleted or destroyed. That was essentially Lloyd's argument. So I have that illustrated here. Let's just say that for this pasture, the carrying capacity is 3 sheep. Pretty small pasture, and we have 3 sheep on that pasture. Carrying capacity is met, and we're all happy because they're not overgrazing that. But say that the farmer, out of self-interest, because he can sell more meat, more wool, or more milk, adds 2 more sheep to that. Some overgrazing is going to start to ensue. You add even more because they really want to milk that land for all it's worth, and overgrazing definitely ensues, and it leads to the destruction of that land. So this idea kind of sat at the margins for about 130 years until Garrett Hardin published an article in Science where he coined the term tragedy of the commons. And he basically explained that entire thing and then connected it to human populations around the planet and how we are living at unsustainable levels. Okay. Now, AP uses the term tragedy of the commons. So that's what we're going to use throughout this entire PowerPoint, throughout this entire course. However, because Hardin was pretty much a jerk and a pretty controversial individual, people are starting to use the term illusion of plenty, but it really hasn't caught on too much. So we're going to use tragedy of the commons because it's what's in the AP standards. So Hardin took this idea of a shared English pasture, a common, and expanded it to many global systems. All of these global systems, these commons, are either public or they're open access or they're international. Okay, one of those 3. Okay, there's definitely some overlap in there. just that they're not privately owned and that they're often not owned by a specific government as well, or within the jurisdiction of a single specific government. They're typically accessible to everyone without restriction, and they are often unregulated, or if they're regulated, it's often very ineffectual. Those regulations are not very effectual. Okay, so let's talk about some examples. I think that the easiest one to think about is air, the air that we breathe every day. It's because the air is at a global system and a global level and it moves throughout every country or the space above every country, nobody owns it. Okay, we might have air laws, air quality laws in Colorado or in the United States that are different from other places in the world. And, even within the United States or within North America or within the world itself. So polluting somebody polluting the atmosphere with CFCs, which degrade the ozone layer in, I don't know, Southeast Asia, Africa, South America, the US, anywhere, is really depleting the ozone layer for everybody on the planet. So the air that we breathe is a common, and it's a shared common among everybody. Water is another great example. Companies can easily just dump their waste into a river, barring any local regulations. That river then flows into the ocean, and all of that waste ends up in the ocean, which is a shared water source by everybody on the planet. Even us living in Colorado in a landlocked state have a vested interest in the purity of the water in the oceans, and we can openly access it. Some other ones, public lands and parks, wildlife, highways, the internet, all of these are public spaces that can be used as commons. So the tragedy of the commons occurs really due to human nature. And it's really this greed before need idea. So the greed for individual self-interest over the common good. Okay, so individual self-interest is put before the common good. Say that I am a shepherd and I put one more sheep onto that pasture, that is plus one profit for me. Okay, however much a sheep is worth, plus one sheep profit for me. It doesn't impact everybody at that same level. No, not everybody has a -1 detriment. That's actually a fraction of the -1 distributed among every member that's sharing that common, and it's spread evenly. Okay, so let's think about another example. Let's say that there is a company that is polluting the air and they're doing so freely. Okay, they can do it at whatever rate they want to, and they don't have to pay any taxes about it. It's just a way for them to get rid of their waste gases, and it's totally free for them to pump it into the atmosphere. That's profit for them. That means that they don't have to pay for that air to be cleaned or that exhaust to be cleaned. However, it's a fraction of that profit, negative the negative amount of that profit for everybody else that's breathing that air. Okay, and it's a smaller fraction the more members there are, and it's a more or less equal fraction. Okay, disregarding distance from the factory and all that stuff. So there's many examples of tragedy of the commons. I'm going to go through these really quickly and skip a few. We talked about the atmosphere a little bit. Water, same thing. Over extraction of fresh water though, so just not pollution, but the over extraction of water resources. Okay, profit for me as a farmer, but everybody else has a little bit less water to use. Forests could be over harvesting timber or logging of old growth forest, deforestation, etc. Overfishing or anything related with HIPCO, light pollution, mining, the human population. And this is really what Hardin focused on the most was human populations. And you guys will see that in the article that we read. There's this human health side. So human health is a common. Okay, it's a really weird abstract space, but it is a common. Think about antibiotics and the development of antibiotic resistant bacteria through the process of natural selection. So that's diagrammed up here. Due to overprescribing antibiotics, bacteria are more and more and more exposed to antibiotics, and they're becoming resistant to those antibiotics, and is really at a detriment of everybody around the planet, everybody's health. Vaccines with herd immunity, sort of similar. The sex ratio, so ratio of males to females. Some cultures have and still do prefer males over females, and that has led to the abortion or abandonment of girls in many cases, leading to an imbalance of the sexes in that culture. Say that there's 55% boys and 45% girls, for example. Okay. Some public spaces. So in general, just public areas. The examples I have here are littering and vandalism. Those are shared areas that are available by all, and by littering or vandalizing, it's at the detriment of everybody else, just aesthetically. Space debris, so there's all of these old satellites. There's small little pieces of satellites that are broken off of old dysfunctional satellites that are kind of starting to clog up the space and near space in the orbit of Earth. Spam email, robocalls, hoarding is a really interesting one. So say that there's an emergency, everybody rushes out to the store and they buy as much as they can and hoard these materials in case there is an emergency at the detriment of everybody else. So if anybody remembers the great toilet paper crisis of March or April of 2020 due to COVID, that's an example of that. So if the tragedy of the commons is a um, product of human nature, how can we get around that? How can we um, get some solutions for the tragedy of the commons? Now I'm going to split these up into non-governmental, which I'm going to call cultural solutions, and then governmental solutions, okay, or regulatory solutions. So for cultural, the first one is a connection to the land. Okay, many indigenous cultures around the world have a deep cultural connection to their land, and they have not um, overused that land in many cases. In some cases they have, but in many cases they have not, just due to this cultural connection to the land, and that leads to sustainable use. Cooperation. Okay, this sounds a little bit more towards the socialist or communist side of this argument, and not as much capitalistic individual, which is one of the um, biggest controversies surrounding the idea of the tragedy of the commons, especially in economic and political realms. But cooperation. Okay, this could include traditional cultures sharing common goods, having shared common areas. This could be modern co-ops. Okay, so you have several farmers that get together and they sell their product as one. This could be a guild. This could be a union. Again, there's the whole political and economic side of this that makes it sound a little bit more left rather than right, but that could be a way to get around the tragedy of the commons. An example of this are Swiss pastures. Okay, so the exact same thing that was happening on English commons, think about that with Swiss pastures. However, Swiss pastures have been common grazing land since the Middle Ages or even earlier, and there's been no degradation to that land. They're still some of the most productive and still some of the best pastures because everybody in the village, all the herders in the village, still manage that land really, really well, and they know not to overgraze it, and they have that connection to the land, and they cooperate with each other, and they're actually also small population sizes. Basically, a similar thing with all nomadic pastoralists that were using the land sustainably throughout the world. Another solution is small population sizes. So let's just say that there are fishing villages that are relatively small, and most of them throughout all of the world, and most of them were fishing at a sustainable rate until they entered into global markets. All of a sudden, they're not feeding just the people in the village, but they're feeding the entire world, and they're supplying fish for the entire world. And the fisheries are therefore overfished because of that, because of just entering into those global markets. Essentially, they went from a small population size, feeding a small population size, to feeding a very large population size. Okay, and then the last bullet point, just morality, self-sacrifice, but I'm not really going to expand on that. All right, some governmental, or maybe we can call this regulatory solutions for the tragedy of the commons. And this is for modern industrialized capitalistic societies is what we're going to focus on because that's what we're looking at in the United States. Um, privatization of land. So first off, not everything, not every common can be privatized. Air, the oceans, they can't be privatized. Okay, but land in most cases can be. If there's no commons, then they can't be overexploited. Okay, now that means that the commons can't be overexploited. That doesn't mean that the land can't be overexploited. So if a landowner does overexploit his resources, then theoretically, they're just going to go bankrupt and it's not going to hurt any of the other landowners around them. Now, in reality, it probably will. It does degrade natural systems if somebody does overexploit their land, if somebody ruins their land in whatever way, say by overgrazing. Say that we have ranchers in, anywhere in the U.S., we have ranchers, and a rancher is, say that we have a very bad rancher that doesn't do things right, and he ends up overgrazing his land, and he ends up losing his herd due to starvation, and he goes bankrupt. But his land is overgrazed, and now it has become desertified, massive erosion and desertification. That land does border other people's lands, and that desertification could start to bleed through the over onto other people's lands. Okay, it's not going to just stop right at this landowner's fence line. It can start to impact the other people's lands just by continuing that process of erosion and desertification past the fence line into his neighbor's lands. Okay, but in theory, privatization is definitely a solution to the tragedy of the commons. Regulation is probably one of the bigger ones. These could be permits. Okay, so maybe you need permits for any of the activities I have listed here. Okay, laws. Laws that regulate what type of pollution you can pollute, how much pollution you can pollute. Laws that regulate water quality. Laws that regulate, this, that, and the other, everything. Negative and positive incentives. A negative incentive, an example of that is taxes. Maybe you have higher taxes the more that you pollute. Okay, or maybe you have cleanup costs of polluting, so you have to, restore like an environment if you degrade it. Okay, that could be a negative incentive. A positive incentive would be like a tax break. A company puts solar panels on their roof and they get a tax break from doing that. Okay, another example of that are subsidies. A subsidy is essentially like you're getting paid the well, there's subsidies can be definitely positive and negative, and they can actually lead to the tragedy of the commons. But in this case, I'm going to say that a subsidy is just going to be a positive incentive, and it's going to reduce the tragedy of the commons. Say that a landowner is not using part of his land because it's critical habitat for an endangered species. So they might get a subsidy to pay them for the lost profit that they'll have by not using that part of their land, that critical habitat. Okay, but subsidies can be used positively and negatively. In terms of the tragedy of the commons, subsidies right now are definitely leading to overfishing in many cases. We'll talk about that when we talk about fishing, but it just depends on how the subsidy is used. Okay, internalizing externalities. And an externality, so I didn't define laws or permits, I figured that you guys knew those, but an externality is a cost that the manufacturer doesn't have to directly pay for, but is paid for, notice the quotes, by everybody else. Okay, an example of that is air pollution. Say that there is a power plant in a neighborhood right next to the power plant, and that power plant is in a country without a lot of air quality laws, and they could just pollute all of this particulate matter into the atmosphere. Kids nearby in that neighborhood are going to be breathing that in, and they're the ones paying for it. The power plant or the power company is freely polluting. It's free for them to pollute, and it actually saves them money to pollute because they would have to have technology on their plant to clean up their exhaust if they otherwise. So it's free for them. They're actually getting profit from that. They put it onto everybody else in that society, and it's the kids with asthma that are going to be breathing that in and paying for that, as well as their parents with their medical costs. So by internalizing an externality, that requires producers to pay for those externalities. That could be a pollution tax. That could be a requiring them to pay to install equipment to clean up their pollution. It could be taxes to maintain the healthcare system in that area. It could be a dumping cost if it's solid waste, etc. So a real example that we all pay for is a gasoline tax. Every one of us, every time that we go to the pump, pays a gasoline tax, and that's intended to pay for road maintenance as well as offset the cost of the pollution. Okay, obviously it doesn't do anything for the CO2 and other gases that are released from the tailpipe, but it's supposed to kind of help pay for some of the programs to mitigate pollution. Again, the sad thing about the tragedy of the commons is that it does reveal something about human nature, and it does typically reveal that most people are inherently selfish. All right, but I'm gonna otherwise skip this slide and move on to sustainability. So the path away from the tragedy of the commons is the sustainable use of resources, what we would call sustainability. So this is like what I described with the Swiss pastures. They have been sustainably used for centuries. Okay, this is the use of natural resources at a rate that can be naturally renewed, or using resources without reducing the natural supply. Okay, we're essentially avoiding the use of non-renewable resources. So for example, fossil fuels, ensuring the availability of resources for future generations. And we'll talk about what an ecological footprint is later on in this unit, but your ecological footprint will be less than 1. Okay, but that doesn't mean anything to you right now. Some natural indicators of sustainable use is going to be the availability and the replenishment of resources. If resources are continually available, then you're probably using those resources sustainably. If resources are starting to become depleted, then you are obviously not using them sustainably. Okay, biological diversity is a great indicator. So whenever a system is being used sustainably, biological diversity is maintained or it even increases rather than decreasing. And then we can think about these other ones mostly in the terms of what they supply for us or in terms of pollution. So let's think of an example. An example could be the use of groundwater. So in this diagram down here in the bottom right, we have all the way or several ways that groundwater can be recharged. So this area is getting rainfall. That rain is going to seep in through the layers of soil and could eventually reach these aquifers down below in the rock. Okay, that is one way that groundwater can be recharged. It can also be recharged just by the input or the influx of water underground via surface water, waterways, okay, which again does come from ultimately precipitation. Okay, and then we have a well. So this is a well that is drawing water up for this house and this farm. Okay, if this landowner was to use this at a sustainable rate, then the rate of groundwater recharge would be greater than the rate of extraction. Okay, so replenishment is greater than or equal to use, but typically we'll think about it as mostly greater than. Okay, so groundwater recharge is greater than the rate of extraction from wells. That's a sustainable use, and that water will be there for future generations. Okay, indefinitely, if it's used sustainably indefinitely. We can contrast this with unsustainable use or non-sustainable use, which will lead to tragedy of the commons if they are on a common area. Okay, this is the use of resources at a rate that cannot be naturally replenished, and it includes high use of non-renewable resources. Mostly we're looking at fossil fuels, but we're also looking at anything else that's mined, such as minerals and metals. Even if there seems to be a whole lot of it, every resource still is finite. Okay, this is going to create what we call a resource deficit that will be quote unquote paid for by future generations as well as the environment. And again, the ecological footprint we haven't talked about yet, but it's going to be greater than 1. We'll watch this video in class, but I'll link it in the description below. And back to the learning objectives. So the essential knowledge for Tragedy of the Commons. The Tragedy of the Commons suggests that individuals will use shared resources in their own self-interest rather than in keeping with the common good, thereby depleting those resources. Again, everybody is acting in their own individual self-interest, and they are all thinking for themselves and not for the sustainable use of those resources, and they are depleting those resources, leading to ruin for everybody. Okay, I do want to again emphasize that commons have to be on a shared space. So that could be shared land, that could be shared air, water, etc. Okay, forests that we all quote unquote own, that are maybe a national forest or a state forest, something like that. And then moving on to sustainability. Sustainability refers to humans living on Earth and their use of resources without depletion of the resources for future generations. Environmental indicators that can guide humans to sustainability include biological diversity, food production, average global temperatures, and CO2 concentrations, human population, and resource depletion. Sustainable yield is the amount of renewable resources that can be taken without reducing the available supply. And again, as we talk about every way that we're using land and water around the planet throughout this unit, we will contrast sustainable and unsustainable use. All right, I hope you guys learned something. I'll see you all in class.